Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Oh, absolutely. It's very straightforward.
Right. Like you fall down, your arm swells up, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right across the radius.
Yeah, the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Exactly. Broken or not broken.
Yeah.
It's clean, it's binary, and honestly, it's deeply comforting. We like things to be visible.
We really do. We love to categorize our problems so we can apply a linear solution, put a cast on it, wait 6 weeks, and problem solved.
Because it gives us this illusion of absolute control.
Totally.
Yeah.
When the variables are physical and visible, the path to healing is, well, it's just a matter of mechanics.
But then you step into the world of organizational health and leadership strategy, and suddenly that x-ray machine is entirely useless.
Yeah, doesn't work at all.
Because when you try to change an organization's structure, you aren't fixing a bone. You are messing with the invisible connective tissue of human relationships.
And deeply held assumptions and unvoiced fears.
Yes, and that is exactly why brilliant, beautifully mapped out, whiteboard perfect strategies just completely crash and burn.
They fail all the time.
All the time. So we are looking at why excellent ideas stall out. And it's not because the strategy was flawed, but because the internal readiness of the organization was fundamentally bankrupt.
Right. It's not about the seed you are planting. It is about the soil you are planting it in.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have this chronic delusion in leadership that if we just get the vision statement right, the culture will automatically align.
Which is, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature.
It really is.
You can have the most strategically sound blueprint in the entire world, but if the foundation you are building it on is fractured, the weight of that new vision will simply collapse the structure faster.
Wow, collapse it faster.
Yeah. What we're really examining here is the deeply human and often spiritual capacity to handle transition. And if we look at this through the lens of faith-based organizations and ministries, though, the exact same sociology applies to corporate restructurings or, neighborhood boards.
Oh, for sure. Human nature is human nature.
Exactly. But we first have to understand what these groups are mistakenly protecting when they resist change.
And that brings us to the biggest ideological roadblock sitting right in the middle of this entire conversation.
Yeah, it's a big one.
There is this incredibly stubborn myth, especially pervasive in religious or highly traditional organizations, that refusing to change is synonymous with virtue.
Yes. There is an assumption that preserving the familiar way of doing things is the exact same thing as guarding the foundational truth. What's fascinating here is that it's a sociological defense mechanism.
How so?
Well, when people in an organization say, we have always done it this way, or that is not who we are, they rarely view themselves as being obstinate or difficult.
Right. They don't wake up wanting to sabotage the team.
No, not at all. In their minds, they are honoring their heritage. They believe they are defending the integrity of the institution.
They think they're the good guys.
Exactly. But there's a crucial distinction that has to be made here between static preservation and what we should actually be aiming for, which is obedient responsiveness.
Obedient responsiveness. Wow, that is a paradigm shift right there.
It changes everything.
Because if you look at the historical and biblical patterns that these very organizations claim to revere, the hallmark of faithfulness was never staying put.
No, it was entirely kinetic.
Right. Take the foundational narratives. Abraham is considered the archetype of faithfulness precisely because he left the familiar structure of Ur.
Yeah, he didn't even have a geographic map. His obedience was entirely dynamic.
And Moses literally leads an entire population out of the highly structured, predictable environment of Egypt.
Which was oppressive, but predictable.
Exactly, into the total unpredictability of the wilderness. The Israelites are following a moving pillar of cloud and fire.
They had to pack up their tents and move when the environment demanded it.
Yes. And even looking at the early church in the book of Acts, they didn't just hunker down in Jerusalem and preserve their initial cultural forms.
They constantly adapted.
Sometimes painfully adapted as their message expanded into entirely new Greek and Roman contexts.
And leaders have to navigate a vital philosophical distinction here. It's the difference between conviction and contingent expression.
Wait, break that down for me. Conviction versus contingent expression.
So conviction is fixed. It's the core truth, the central mission, the undeniable bedrock of why the organization exists.
Right, that does not change.
Never. That is the anchor. But the contingent expression, how that organization structures its Tuesday morning meetings, how it budgets its outreach, the physical medium through which it communicates to its neighborhood.
Like using newsletters versus an app?
Exactly. That has to remain fluid. When an organization refuses to adapt its expressions, it isn't being faithful to its convictions, it is actually being fearful.
And the quietest, most insidious rival to that kind of responsiveness isn't necessarily terror or panic. It is comfort.
Comfort is the ultimate silencer.
I think a lot of leaders are looking for active rebellion when they diagnose resistance, but comfort prefers the routine simply because it avoids the psychological disruption of learning something new.
Because disruption requires a massive amount of humility.
It really does. It requires a veteran leader or a longtime volunteer to admit that the skills they have mastered over the last 20 years might not be the most effective tools for the next 20 years.
And that feels like a very real sense of loss.
It does.
And we have to ask why human beings defend traditions so fiercely. It is almost never because they have data proving the tradition is currently effective at achieving the mission.
No, it's rarely about the data.
It is because traditions act as psychological scaffolding. They provide emotional security.
Right.
They offer a highly predictable environment where people know exactly how to succeed and exactly what their social standing is.
So the forms serve the mission, but they are not the mission.
Exactly. But when a specific methodology becomes untouchable, when a leader can't even suggest altering the format of a monthly gathering without sparking a localized civil war.
Oh, I have seen that happen.
Right. It indicates that the organization has deeply confused the means with the ends.
Let's ground this in a reality that plays out every single day. Consider the classic scenario of a community church or a local nonprofit that has used the exact same neighborhood outreach model for 30 years.
Like a big centralized event.
Yeah, exactly. And back in the 90s, it worked flawlessly. It was the absolute gold standard.
Everyone showed up.
Everyone. But over 3 decades, the neighborhood demographics have entirely shifted. The rhythms of life, the economic realities, the way people communicate, it has all changed.
So a new leader steps in.
Right. A new leader steps in, does an environmental scan, and says, hey, our mission is the same, but our methodology is obsolete.
And they suggest a pivot.
Yeah. They say we need to transition from these large, centralized events to smaller, decentralized, digitally connected groups.
And immediately, the system's immune response kicks in.
Oh, instantly. Resistance flares up. The immediate reflex is, well, this is not how we do things here.
But the question they should be asking is, are we being faithful to what we are called to do now, or just faithful to a memory?
Okay, but I want to push back on this a little bit because I think modern leadership theory sometimes breeds an unhelpful arrogance.
That's a fair point.
It's very easy for a new visionary leader to just write off all that resistance as organizational stubbornness. But isn't it more profound than that?
It usually is.
It feels like looking at a family refusing to move out of a house that is objectively falling apart. Like the foundation is cracked, the plumbing is destroyed, but they are clinging to it because they took their first steps in that hallway.
Yeah.
They celebrated decades of holidays in that living room. They aren't trying to be difficult to the real estate agent, you know. They are actively grieving a loss of shared memory and identity.
I love that. If we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, your analogy captures the precise emotional reality of organizational change.
Because it's not malicious.
The family isn't malicious at all. They are mourning. And this is exactly why leadership cannot be reduced to simply executing a strategy.
It requires empathy.
Profound empathy and discernment. A leader has to distinguish between a community protecting its core convictions, a community protecting its actual people, and a community merely protecting its nostalgia and emotional security.
That is a tricky tightrope to walk.
It is. Preservation is only a noble act when it protects the actual mission. When it exists solely to protect the emotional comfort of the insiders, it devolves into obstruction.
Which brings us to a massive counterintuitive pivot.
Right.
Because we just spent a significant amount of time dismantling the idea that true faithfulness means never changing. We have established that staying static is a failure.
Absolutely.
But there is an equal and opposite danger that traps just as many organizations, maybe even more.
And what's that?
The danger of rushing headlong into massive change just because everyone in the room happens to be incredibly hyped up about it.
Yes, this is the exact trap that snares visionary, charismatic Leaders.
They just love the momentum.
They cast a compelling vision, the room erupts in applause, people are nodding along, and the leader mistakenly assumes that because people are cheering for the destination, the organization is structurally and emotionally ready for the journey.
But there is a stark, uncompromising line between enthusiasm and readiness.
Huge difference.
I am obsessed with this distinction because enthusiasm is entirely reactive. It is a neurological spike.
It's just a feeling.
Right. It lives in the moment and thrives on external stimulation. You go to a weekend retreat or you bring in a dynamic keynote speaker and you get this massive dopamine hit. Everyone is fired up.
But readiness.
Readiness is the condition that remains after the dopamine metabolizes. It is durable because it has been tested by friction.
Yes. There's this brilliant metaphorical framework from the text.
Yeah.
A spark is not a house.
Oh, I love that. A spark is not a house.
It is a chillingly accurate metaphor for leadership. I mean, a spark is essential. It initiates the fire. It gives you intense heat and brilliant light for a fleeting moment.
But you can't live in it.
Exactly. A spark cannot shelter a family from a winter storm. A house requires architectural planning, deep foundation work, structural integrity, and the slow, unglamorous discipline of laying bricks.
And enthusiasm is just the spark.
Just the spark.
Yeah.
And the danger of relying on enthusiasm is that it actively blinds you to the hidden structural deficits.
It totally masks the reality waiting for you on Monday morning.
Yes, all the ugly stuff.
The old habits, the fragile interpersonal trust between departments, the hard budget constraints, the chronic communication breakdowns.
None of that goes away just because everyone clapped on Saturday.
Right. All those realities don't evaporate just because you had a great offsite meeting.
It is fascinating to look at this through a historical or spiritual lens, too.
How so?
Well, God often awakens holy desire long before he builds the endurance necessary to sustain it.
Oh, that's a great point. You look at the Israelites at the Red Sea, they are literally singing, dancing, playing tambourines. They are at peak enthusiasm about being liberated.
But 3 days later.
3 days later, when the brutal structural reality of the wilderness sets in, they are immediately demanding to go back to the comfort of their captivity in Egypt.
Because it is profoundly easy to fall in love with the idea of change while aggressively resisting the actual work of change.
We all love the language of innovation.
We do. We love the rhetoric of growth, of reaching new demographics, of bearing more fruit. But the actual mechanics of that growth require reordering our daily lives.
It requires surrender.
It requires the surrender of comfortable habits, the redistribution of resources, and the grueling work of building genuine relational trust.
It's separating emotional agreement from shared capacities.
Exactly. It takes very little skill to generate emotional agreement in a room with a compelling narrative and a good slide deck.
I can get anyone to agree with a good slide deck.
Right. But it takes immense leadership to build the shared capacity required to execute that narrative when everyone goes back to their respective silos.
Think about the classic post-conference crash.
Okay.
A congregation or a nonprofit board attends a massive weekend summit on community outreach. The speaker is incredible. People are moved to tears.
They're ready to change the world.
In the heat of the moment, volunteers step up, pledges are made, and a massive new initiative is instantly launched on a wave of pure emotion.
But fast forward 6 or 8 months.
The emotional high is completely gone, and now you have profound tensions over who is actually supposed to manage the logistics.
And the money.
The funding is drying up, and worse, the people running the legacy programs are getting incredibly defensive because they feel like this new, shiny initiative is cannibalizing their resources.
Yeah, they feel threatened.
The vision itself was beautiful, the enthusiasm was completely genuine, but the internal readiness of the organization was fundamentally hollow.
That's the trap.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to challenge this logic.
I challenge away.
If I am a leader and I finally get my historically stubborn team fired up about a new direction, am I really supposed to just pump the brakes?
It feels wrong, doesn't it?
It feels terrible. Doesn't momentum matter?
I mean, in the business world, we talk about striking while the iron is hot. If I intentionally slow things down, aren't I just risking that the spark goes out completely?
It is the natural instinct to capitalize on momentum immediately. But doing so without structural readiness is how you break organizations.
So what's the alternative?
The concept we have to introduce here is delay as discipleship, or delay as formation.
Delay as formation.
The goal of recognizing unreadiness isn't to be a cynic. You aren't pouring cold water on your team to punish their excitement. Wise leaders do not punish enthusiasm, they steward it.
How do you steward it?
They recognize that the liminal space, the waiting period between the spark of excitement and the actual structural implementation of change, is where the real work happens.
In the waiting. Yes. That delay is where weak trust is exposed and fortified. It is where hidden motives are clarified. Delay isn't the denial of the vision. It is the necessary preparation of the soil.
Stewarding enthusiasm instead of just exploiting it for a quick, flashy launch.
Exactly.
That is a radically different cadence for leadership.
Okay.
But it begs a massive operational question.
Which is?
If enthusiasm is essentially a chemical smokescreen masking our unreadiness, how do we actually pierce through that? How do we take the true structural temperature of the organization without just relying on everyone saying, yeah, I'm on board?
You have to move into a highly intentional diagnostic phase.
Right.
And this isn't about sending out a sterile 1 to 5 scale survey via email.
Those never work anyway.
Ever. You have to ask questions that act as what some call instruments of grace. Questions designed to compassionately but ruthlessly expose the inner weather of the organizational culture.
Okay, let's dig into the specific diagnostic angles here because these are not your standard HR questions.
No, they are deep.
The first angle we have to investigate is, what specific part of our culture inherently resists strategic change?
And notice the phrasing there.
Right. We aren't asking who is resisting. We aren't hunting for a scapegoat. We are asking what part of the culture itself is the barrier.
That distinction is paramount. It forces leaders to look at the environment, not just the individuals.
Yeah.
You have to determine if your culture is primarily protective or primarily missional.
Protective versus missional.
Has the organization implicitly learned to prize familiarity and internal comfort above actual external effectiveness?
Wow.
If the unwritten rules of your culture inherently punish risk-taking and socially reward those who maintain the status quo, then any new strategic seed you plant will be starved of oxygen before it even germinates.
It's doomed from the start.
Completely.
The second diagnostic angle goes right back to our conversation about enthusiasm. We have to ask, are we genuinely ready for mission clarity, or are we just momentarily entertained by new ideas?
Because clarity and enthusiasm are often confused.
But they yield entirely different results. Enthusiasm lacks concrete, operational understanding. It is a feeling.
Right.
Clarity, on the other hand, provides staying power. Because if people don't have absolute clarity on the why and the how, they will inevitably fill that vacuum with their own assumptions.
And usually those assumptions are driven by anxiety.
Exactly. Which perfectly transitions into the third and perhaps most revealing diagnostic layer.
This one is huge.
What fears are shaping our response to this change more than our actual faith or our strategic vision?
Because fear is an incredibly brilliant actor in organizational dynamics.
Oh, it really is. It hides so well.
In a boardroom, a committee meeting, or a staff retreat, fear almost never introduces itself as fear.
Never.
It dresses up in a three-piece suit and calls itself prudence.
Prudence.
It calls itself caution or financial stewardship. It claims to be nobly protecting the organization from unnecessary risk, but in reality, it is simply protecting the psychological comfort and the positional power of the people currently in charge.
That is such a profound concept. Fear disguising itself as prudence, it makes it almost impossible to combat because if you argue against prudence, you sound reckless.
You sound like a loose cannon.
Right. This brings us to the fourth diagnostic, and honestly, this is the one that completely shifts how you view team dynamics.
Let's hear it.
You have to ask, where has silence replaced honest conversation? Because we have this terrifying tendency to look at a quiet room and assume it means we have achieved peace and alignment.
Which is a fatal mistake.
It is, because a quiet room usually just means honesty has become entirely too costly. It is like looking at a perfectly flat, calm surface of the ocean, but knowing there is a violent, lethal riptide operating right underneath.
Yeah, the surface is deceiving.
If I present a massive strategic pivot to my leadership team, and I ask for feedback, and all I hear are crickets or polite nods, my ego wants to say, wow, I'm a great communicator, everyone is 100% on board.
You feel great about yourself.
But the reality is, I have probably just trained them over months or years that speaking up is socially or professionally dangerous. The silence isn't agreement. It is a survival mechanism.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this raises an incredibly important point about power dynamics.
Tell me more.
Enduring, resilient communities are never, ever built on avoidance or the suppression of dissent. They are built on truth.
Always.
If you look at the historical formation of the early church, It wasn't built by sweeping deep cultural conflicts under the rug. It was built through incredibly difficult public truth-telling and reconciliation.
People actually talked it out.
Yes, when leadership power dynamics suppress honest feedback, whether that is because a leader has a history of snapping at criticism, dismissing concerns as a lack of faith, or making professional conflict deeply personal,
The organization loses its immune system.
it entirely loses its ability to heal.
Which leaves us with the fifth and final diagnostic angle. What legacy are we protecting that may no longer actually serve the mission?
This is incredibly delicate territory.
It is. We absolutely have to honor the past and the sacrifices that brought the organization to where it is today. But the danger occurs when memory mutates into captivity.
Honoring the past is a core leadership responsibility, but you do not honor the past by freezing it in amber.
Freezing it in amber, that's a great image.
You honor the historical sacrifices of an organization by ensuring that its core mission continues to bear fruit in the present day.
Right.
If you are zealously protecting a legacy program, a legacy building, or a legacy methodology that is actively hindering your ability to reach your current demographic, you have turned a historical gift into a present-day prison.
A present-day prison.
I have seen historical congregations realize, through asking these exact questions, that their massive resistance to a new community initiative wasn't based on theology at all.
What was it based on?
It was purely emotional and cultural. Asking these questions didn't magically vaporize the tension, but it finally opened the room for genuine, unvarnished honesty.
Okay, so we have the diagnostic framework. We have run the X-ray, we have bypassed the illusion of a clean break, and we can clearly see the complex fractures in the culture.
We know it's broken.
But insight is not a cure. Knowing your bone is broken doesn't set the bone. Knowing your culture is fundamentally unready doesn't magically align it.
It definitely doesn't.
We have to move from intellectual diagnosis to highly concrete behavioral action. How do we actually rebuild the soil?
This is where leadership transitions from philosophy to architecture. There are specific, sequential actions required to move an organization from mere awareness of its dysfunction into genuine, shared alignment.
Okay, what's step one?
The first action is to formalize a readiness assessment, but the methodology here is critical. This must be an act of shared, collective discernment, not a defensive grading exercise from the executive suite.
Oh, that distinction is everything. It can't be the CEO or the senior pastor handing out report cards, essentially telling the staff, here is where you all are failing to grasp my genius vision.
That will just build more resentment.
Exactly. It has to be the community telling the truth about its own capacity without fear of retribution.
Right.
And that leads to the second action, which requires immense discipline. Identify one cultural barrier, just one.
Which is so hard for leaders to do.
Because the instinct when you realize your culture is broken is to try and boil the ocean. We want to overhaul everything by next quarter.
Want to fix yesterday.
But you have to find the dominant pattern. Is the root issue a paralyzing fear of conflict? Is it an overdependence on a single charismatic leader? You have to isolate the deepest root and focus all your initial rehabilitative energy right there.
Because if you try to fix 6 cultural deficits simultaneously, you will simply exhaust the organization and accelerate its decline.
You'll just break them.
Yep. Once you have isolated that single barrier, the third action is to design a relentless communication plan. And we need to redefine what communication actually means in this context.
How so?
Communication is not the mere transfer of legitimate data. It is the shepherding of understanding.
Shepherding of understanding.
A mature communication plan consistently answers 3 questions. What exactly is changing? Why is it changing now? And most crucially, what is absolutely not changing?
That third question, what is not changing, is the psychological anchor.
It grounds everyone.
Because when everything feels chaotic, people need to know that the core identity is safe. But how we deliver that communication matters just as much as what we say. Which brings us to the fourth action.
And this is the one everyone gets wrong.
Probably the most counterintuitive, heavily violated rule in modern leadership. You must have trust-building conversations before making strategic announcements. Stop prioritizing the microphone over the coffee table.
The behavioral psychology behind this is profound. Organizations universally default to announcements because announcements are highly efficient and completely controllable.
You can script them perfectly.
You draft a perfect memo, you approve the verbiage, you send the email, and you get to check the box that says communication achieved.
But mass announcements prioritize the delivery of the message over the psychological preparation of the receiver.
Exactly. When interpersonal trust is absent in a culture, Even the most logical, necessary, universally beneficial change will be received as a hostile threat,
Wow, even a good change.
even a great change. But when deep trust is present, an organization can absorb incredibly painful, disruptive changes with grace and resilience.
So what does the leader actually do?
You have to sit down with the key influencers, the formal leaders, and the informal matriarchs and patriarchs of the culture, and you have to admit what you don't know.
You have to be vulnerable.
You have to genuinely ask, what is going to make this transition particularly painful for you?
And the final action to round this out isn't really a strategic step at all. It is a formational one.
Right.
Whether you call it prayer or cultivating internal character, the goal is to form the capacity to handle the journey. It is not just about asking for a clearer roadmap. It is about becoming the kind of cohesive community that can actually walk that rough road together without fracturing into a million cynical factions.
So what does this all mean?
Well, I have to stop here because this entire methodology sounds agonizingly slow. Let's inject some real-world urgency into this.
Sure.
It feels like stopping to check the tire pressure when the engine block is already on fire.
That's how it feels in the moment, yeah.
If I am leading an organization that is bleeding capital or a nonprofit that is losing relevance by the day, taking 6 months to have one-on-one empathetic coffee dates with every single stakeholder feels like absolute organizational suicide.
It feels irresponsible.
In a true crisis, shouldn't urgent execution trump emotional process?
It is the most common, visceral pushback every leader has. And the tension you're describing is entirely valid.
Because the pressure is real.
It is. But we have to return to the foundational thesis. Readiness is not proven by speed. It is proven by stability under pressure.
Okay.
If you are on a sinking ship, yes, urgency is required. But if you rush a panicked, unready, disconnected group of people toward the lifeboats without establishing clear lines of trust and communication, you don't save them.
You just create a stampede.
You create a stampede. People get trampled. Moving faster than your organization's internal formation allows will not save the organization. The sheer centrifugal force of your new strategy will simply tear the remaining cultural fabric to shreds.
The centrifugal force of the strategy. That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Fast execution of a great strategy on a fragile culture just blows the culture apart.
It rips it apart.
Okay, as we move into the final layer of this deep dive, we need to bring this all the way down to the ground. How does this high-level theology of change and sociological theory actually manifest in the daily mundane habits of a leader?
Because it has to be practical.
Right. Because if this doesn't change what I do at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, it is just theory.
Exactly. Theory without tactical application is just intellectual entertainment. We have to establish specific daily tools to manage the cognitive and emotional load of this process.
What's the first tool?
One of the most effective tactical habits for leaders navigating this delay is the utilization of a formal waiting on list.
Oh, I love the mechanics of this. The waiting on list is entirely about protecting the leader's cognitive bandwidth.
Because our bandwidth is limited.
Right. We all carry these open mental loops. You know, you're waiting for the board to review your proposal. You're waiting for a key funder to reply. You're waiting for a conflict between two managers to naturally mature before you intervene.
And if you keep all of that in your head,
the anxiety will crush you. Moving it to a dedicated list physically removes the cognitive load, and that pairs perfectly with the bandwidth audit.
The bandwidth audit requires you to sit down and literally categorize the top 10 recurring anxieties or friction points in your team.
You actually write them out.
You write them out and you force yourself to define. Is this anxiety requiring an immediate action? Is it requiring a structural decision? Does it just need a clarifying conversation? Or, and this is often the hardest for leaders to accept, is it simply environmental noise that needs to be surrendered because you have zero control over it?
Oh, we hate accepting that.
We do, but it stops you from trying to manage the unmanageable.
And then there is an exercise that acts as the ultimate clarifying tool. You take a piece of paper and you draw a hard line right down the middle.
Column A and column B.
Exactly. Column A is exclusively for convictions. These are the absolute non-negotiables. If it is a church, it is the gospel, the core theology. If it is a business, it is the foundational mission statement and core ethical integrity.
And column B.
Column B is for methods. This is the service times, the meeting formats, the specific software stack you use, the style of communication.
This raises an important question, though.
Okay.
How do people usually mess this up?
Well, it is exactly like trying to understand a computer system. Column A is your hard drive, the physical architecture and the core truth. That is protected at all costs. It doesn't change.
Right.
Column B is your software. And the reality of software is that no matter how cutting edge it was when you installed it, you have to continually run updates.
You have to update the software.
If you refuse to update the software because you are nostalgic for the old interface, eventually the entire system crashes and becomes totally incompatible with the modern world.
That analogy reveals so much about organizational psychology. If an organization's true identity is permanently anchored in the hard drives, in column A, and its unshakable convictions, why does the leadership team panic so intensely when the software in column B simply needs a routine update?
Because we love the software.
The painful reality is that we panic because we have quietly, over years and decades, made an idol out of the software.
Oh, wow.
When your personal or organizational identity becomes inextricably tied to a specific program, a specific methodology, or a specific leadership style, any change to that method feels like a literal loss of self.
It feels like an existential threat.
But when your identity remains fiercely tied only to the core mission, changing a method doesn't feel like a threat at all. It simply becomes a necessary act of stewardship.
That dynamic is exactly what it means when we say growth exposes what stability conceals.
Say more about that.
Well, when an organization is completely static, nobody is pushing the boundaries. You can have incredibly weak interpersonal trust, you can have massive communication black holes, and it doesn't really matter because the system isn't under any load.
There's no pressure on it.
Exactly. But the moment you introduce actual growth, the moment new people arrive, new financial pressures mount, new cultural ideas are introduced, those underlying invisible fractures completely cracked wide open.
The growth didn't cause the cracks. It just revealed them.
Right. Organizational maturity isn't about having a flawless strategy or a team that never argues. Maturity is defined entirely by how the group responds under pressure.
Yes.
Can they receive critical feedback without defaulting to defensiveness? Can they profoundly disagree on a strategic direction without causing a permanent relational division?
Precisely. And building that kind of maturity requires intentional, visible reps. It involves implementing short-term, highly focused health plans, like focusing entirely on clarifying communication pathways for 30 days or practicing visible trust-building habits in executive meetings.
It's deliberate work.
Because at the end of the day, a healthy organization is not a utopian, frictionless environment. It is simply an organization that is coherent enough that its internal relational life does not constantly sabotage its external mission.
It has been a truly paradigm-shifting journey today. We started by completely dismantling the false idol of comfort that so many organizations disguise as faithfulness.
We did.
We analyzed the incredibly dangerous neurochemistry of enthusiasm and how it tricks us into believing we have a durable house when all we really have is a fleeting spark.
We navigated the deep, often uncomfortable diagnostic layers, confronting the ways fear masquerades as prudence, the lethal riptides of organizational silence, and the subtle ways our legacy can turn into captivity.
And we bridged the gap from theory to action, exploring the behavioral necessity of moving at the speed of trust, separating our convictions from our methods, and prioritizing deep relational alignment over fast, controllable announcements.
That's a lot to process.
It is. The ultimate inescapable takeaway here is that if your vision is stalling, you probably don't need to spend another 20 hours refining the strategy.
No, the strategy is probably fine.
You need to spend the next 6 months building a more mature, emotionally ready organization capable of carrying it. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something that flips the lens entirely as you look at your own leadership journey.
I love this part.
We spend so much time analyzing why the team or the culture or the board resists change. But what if the lack of readiness isn't actually out there in the organization?
What if it's inside?
What if you, as the leader, are subconsciously using the relentless pursuit of new strategies to avoid doing your own internal work? Strategy is clean, it is intellectual, and it keeps you moving fast.
It's much easier.
But sitting with the emotional messiness of a team, slowing down to build trust, and admitting your own fears, that requires an agonizing level of vulnerability. The next time you find yourself frustrated that your organization isn't ready for your brilliant new idea, ask yourself, are you driving this change to fulfill the mission, or are you driving it to outrun your own discomfort with the slow, quiet work of actual leadership?
That is the ultimate mirror. It demands that we stop viewing leadership as the mere management of external outcomes and accept it as the profound, grueling work of shepherding mutual transformation, starting with ourselves.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Take a hard look at the unreadiness, both in your culture and in yourself, and start doing the deep, necessary work of actually getting ready.